What would you do if your daughter was having a severe allergic reaction mid-flight, but the flight attendant refused to help? Just because there wasn't a doctor's note attached to the ticket? No one screamed. No video was taken as evidence. There was no loud argument, just a father holding his daughter's hand, shaking with fear, a sister trying to shout with reason, and a little girl, her face turning blue, lips drying out, sitting in seat 7B, struggling to breathe. 43 seconds later, a call was made. 13 minutes later, the entire flight was grounded. 48 hours later, the airline's CEO had to hold a national press conference. And 1 week later, a new medical protocol named after that little girl, the Nyla Protocol, was implemented nationwide. This isn't fiction. This is what happened. And it started in a standard economy seat where no one ever expected a child could change the entire airline industry. The sound of the jet engine hummed steadily like a mechanical lullaby, loud enough to drown out the rustle of cabin noise, but not so loud as to muffle the footsteps across the floor, the clatter of rolling suitcases, or the murmured voices of strangers sitting side by side. Seat 7B, the one by the window, felt slightly cold, faintly reflecting the shapes of clouds that hadn't yet formed. After 3 gate changes, 1 flight delay, and 2 rounds of strict security checks, 17-year-old Nyla Brooks had finally made it to that seat. And in that moment, all prior inconveniences seemed to fade away. She rested her head against the curved plastic frame of the window, exhaled a thin breath that fogged up the inner glass, and gazed out at the vast runway of Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport, where concrete stretched into the horizon, twinkling with red and amber lights, and the shadows of heavy aircraft lifting off the ground. Beside her sat her mother, Renee, adjusting her neck pillow, opening the air vent, folding her jacket neatly, occasionally glancing at her daughter to make sure everything was okay. Sitting between them was Dr. Elias Brooks, a man with a refined appearance, a calm demeanor, and the alertness typical of someone in the medical field. They looked like an educated black family, dressed simply yet elegantly, heading somewhere important. And in truth, they were. Neela wore her braided hair pulled back, her face slender but bright, and her eyes intelligent, eyes that seemed to speak. She had on a deep navy hoodie with the words SCI Scholars, Georgia State, in soft-fitting black leggings. Elias wore his usual travel uniform, beige blazer, white open-collar shirt, gray slacks, and the kind of composed air that could make a stranger mistake him for a lawyer or university professor. In fact, he was a pediatric immunologist and a full-time faculty member at Emory University, titles he rarely mentioned outside the hospital or lecture halls. But today on this flight, Elias was neither doctor nor professor. He was simply a father. And in that role, he felt a responsibility heavier than any white coat he had ever worn. Elias looked at his daughter. She was breathing evenly, naturally, comfortably. To others, that might seem normal, but to him, it was nothing short of a miracle. There were years when even sitting upright had been an exhausting ordeal. Diagnosed with autoimmune polymyositis at age 11, Neela's life had become a cycle of medications, injections, treatment regimens, and fragile hope. There were mornings she couldn't get out of bed, afternoons when even swallowing water brought her to tears, birthday parties postponed for test results, Christmases spent in recovery rooms where the smell of antiseptic overwhelmed even the scent of gingerbread. But somehow, she kept going, not just surviving, thriving, top of her class, full state honor scholarship recipient, robotics team captain, and now she was headed to Seattle to begin a special joint program between MIT and NASA's Ames Research Center, a doorway to the future few high school students ever got to step through. None of that would be possible without the small thermal pouch carefully packed inside her carry-on backpack. Elias had prepped it at 4:30 a.m. He checked the gel packs, remeasured the interior temperature with a digital thermometer, and double-checked every TSA-approved medical exemption clause. Inside the pouch were 4 syringes containing a specially formulated biologic, the only medication that allowed his daughter's body to function without hospitalization. This wasn't something off the shelf. It couldn't be refilled at a pharmacy. It was manufactured in a specialized lab in Raleigh, required a week to synthesize, and cost as much as a used car per dose. And most importantly, it had to be kept cold. If not, the proteins would break down and the medication would be useless. No medicine meant Nyla would relapse within 48 hours. A week later, she might lose mobility. 2 weeks later, her respiratory system could begin to fail. Elias knew all of this, not just as a father, but because he had once served as a clinical advisor to the research team that developed the drug. His gaze returned to the small silver-gray pouch, tucked into the outer pocket of the backpack, looking like an ordinary object, yet holding his daughter's entire future. It wasn't larger than a paperback novel, but to him, it was everything. "You okay, sweetheart?" Elias asked, his voice lower than even the engine's hum. Neela turned her head, smiling, a smile that started in her eyes and reached her cheeks. "I'm good. Like, actually good," she replied. "Like, goosebumps, but the excited kind, not the scared kind." Elias chuckled softly, then glanced at his wife. Renee shook her head with a laugh, squeezing hand sanitizer into her palm. "She's high on excitement. I'll allow it, as long as she doesn't forget the afternoon dose." "I won't, Mom," Nyla said, lifting her wrist to show her Apple Watch. "I set the reminder. Siri will haunt me if I forget." Elias nodded, though his eyes kept flicking toward the pouch. The habit of a father who'd lost too many nights of sleep to his daughter's coughs was not easy to unlearn. 10:42 a.m. The airplane door closed. The flight crew checked seatbelts. The cabin lights dimmed to a softer glow. Sky Connect Airways. Flight 218 officially left the gate, and Vanessa Doyle, the lead flight attendant, made her entrance. She stood 2 rows ahead, platinum blonde hair tied in a bun as tight as wire, makeup so meticulously applied that her foundation was visible even under cabin lights. Her name badge sparkled under the overheads. Elias knew nothing about her, yet he had already observed how she spoke to the Asian passenger with a slow, childlike tone, how she grew visibly annoyed while helping an elderly Hispanic man fasten his seatbelt, and how her eyes scanned every black traveler with a familiar kind of vigilance, one Elias had seen too many times in ERs and hospital corridors. Bias wrapped in professional polish. He noticed, but said nothing. The plane began to taxi. The engines roared. The buildings outside slid backward like a cut-out movie set. Light bounced off the window, and in that moment, when the entire cabin shuddered and lifted from the ground, the Brooks family seemed to rise with their hope. They didn't know that at the front of the cabin, a woman with a fake smile and borrowed authority was preparing to dismantle their entire journey, with nothing more than a glance at what appeared to be an innocent little bag. Less than 10 minutes after the plane reached cruising altitude, the shift in the air began to show. Not in cabin pressure, but in the way a woman's eyes swept down the rows of seats. Vanessa Doyle walked the aisle at a measured pace, her navy blue uniform tailored to accentuate her slim frame and sharp, compact face. Every step she took made a sound like the click of a switch, a sound that people like Elias couldn't help but notice. His eyes hadn't left the backpack holding the medicine pouch, but now his focus had shifted to something else. The flight attendant, with perfectly bleached blonde hair, tightly pressed into a bun, a textbook example of airline-appropriate appearance. Except her eyes darted around like they were constantly scanning for something wrong. Vanessa didn't say much, but it was what she didn't say that was the real danger. When she stopped by row 10, Elias saw how gently she leaned in to help a middle-aged white man fasten his seatbelt, and then, just 5 minutes later, how she barked at an Asian woman for misplacing her handbag. Every word she spoke was technically correct, but utterly devoid of compassion. And that kind of cold precision could only be seen clearly by those who had spent a lifetime living in the shadows of expertly trained insincerity. Elias glanced at his wife. Renee had begun to notice too. She bit her lower lip and gently squeezed his arm. They didn't say anything, only exchanged a knowing look. Parents who had watched their daughter be misjudged by a first glance too many times weren't the kind to ignore a familiar feeling, especially not at 35,000 feet. Neela, however, hadn't noticed. She was still gazing out the window, whispering astronomy terms to herself as a way to regulate her breathing under the widening sky. But Elias knew, one wrong signal, and everything could collapse. Vanessa kept moving. When she reached row 7, Her eyes flicked down at Nayla, then paused. Not because there was a technical issue, not because someone broke a rule, but simply because something in her gaze sharpened. Elias saw it clearly. The tiny crease of her brow, the faint scowl as her eyes landed on the dark gray backpack at Nayla's feet. It was tucked neatly, not blocking the aisle, perfectly positioned. But somehow its very presence, or the person it belonged to, seemed to register as non-compliant in Vanessa's mind. "That bag needs to be pushed further in," she said, not loudly, but with a clipped tone. Elias offered a polite smile and nudged the backpack inward a few more centimeters with his foot. "Thank you," he said softly, not meeting her eyes. Vanessa lingered for a moment, then walked on. But Elias knew it wasn't over. He turned to his daughter. "Everything okay, sweetheart?" Nyla turned, nodded. "I've got a bit of a headache. I think it's just the pressure. I'll probably need to inject a little earlier than usual." Elias gave a slight nod. "All right, just rest for now. I'll get you some water in a bit." He placed his hand gently on her back, a calming gesture. 15 minutes later, as the cabin lights shifted to a soft, warm tone, signaling the end of light snack service, Elias pressed the call button. Vanessa returned. "Excuse me," Elias said. "My daughter needs to administer her medication on schedule. Could I please have a cup of water?" Vanessa glanced at Nayla, then looked down at the backpack. "All passengers will be served in order. Please be patient." "I understand," Elias replied, voice still calm. "But this is a time-sensitive medical matter. We have all the documentation ready." Vanessa raised an eyebrow and exhaled sharply, a deliberate sigh, the kind used by people accustomed to wielding small power to signal performative fatigue. She turned away, poured water from a large bottle, and placed the cup down hard on the tray table, a few drops splashing over the rim. "Here you go." Elias said nothing. He picked it up and handed it to his daughter. Neela unzipped the backpack, gently pulling out the insulated pouch. Her hands were still trembling, not from fear, but from the kind of fatigue common in patients whose bodies were overdue for medicine. But only seconds later, Vanessa turned back. "What is that?" she asked, this time with no trace of customer service in her voice. Neela jumped. "It's my medication. It's an injection. I need to examine it." "That's not necessary," Elias said, his voice still low but firm. "This is medically cleared medication. I can show you the paperwork." He reached into the seat back pocket, pulling out a plastic folder containing copies of her medical records, prescription slips, and the TSA exemption documents. But Vanessa didn't even glance at them. "We have strict rules about undeclared liquids and items," she said. "We declared it," Elias answered, this time more clearly. "You're overstepping your authority." Vanessa didn't respond. She bent down quickly and snatched the pouch from Nyla's hands. "Hey!" Nyla cried out, the sound full of shock and outrage. "I'll be showing this to the captain," Vanessa said coldly. She turned and marched toward the front of the plane. The cabin fell into a stunned silence. Elias didn't get up. He closed his eyes for a second, then opened them, staring at the empty space Vanessa had left behind. Something inside him had shifted. A switch. A boundary. Nyla didn't say anything for the first 30 seconds after the pouch was snatched from her hands. She simply stared after the blonde woman's retreating figure, disappearing behind the curtain at the front of the plane. Her breath caught, her body frozen as if stunned by an electric jolt. Elias placed his hand on his daughter's shoulder, but said nothing. Both he and Renee knew that sometimes silence was the only form of protection left. Outside the window, the sky remained a calm shade of blue, oblivious to the fact that a single action had just shifted the entire dynamic of this flight. Nyla turned to her father, her eyes wide and hollow. "She took it," she said, her voice breaking from a throat tightened by shock. "She took the medicine, Dad." Elias nodded, his eyes fixed on the curtain where Vanessa had vanished. He took a deep breath, and for the first time in years, he felt his own body trembling. Not from fear, but from a fury compressed to its limit. Elias had lived long enough to know some battles weren't worth picking, some conflicts were better left alone for a greater good. But not this time. This wasn't about a missing bag or a wrong meal tray. This was life. This was a piece of his daughter's living body, taken literally. And he, who had once authored the official guidance on transporting biologics on aircraft, was now watching a non-expert violate every standard in the name of protocol, in the name of safety. He stood up. Renee tugged gently at his sleeve, whispering, "Be careful. Don't let them bait you." Elias gave a small nod, placed a hand on both his wife and daughter's shoulders. "Stay here. I'm getting it back." As he walked toward the front of the aircraft, the eyes of other passengers began to follow him. A tall black man with a tense face, striding decisively toward the front cabin. This was not an image easily interpreted generously in this environment. A middle-aged woman in a red cardigan whispered something to her seatmate. A white teenager yanked off his headphones and watched with a wary expression. But Elias didn't care. He was used to entering patient rooms under skeptical glances, used to having to prove himself twice over to be trusted. But this time he wasn't here to ask. He was here to reclaim what should never have been taken in the first place. The curtain was pulled aside. The front cabin area was a narrow space where two flight attendants stood facing each other. Vanessa and an older woman in a uniform of higher rank. The senior lead flight attendant, likely the one in charge of the whole cabin. Vanessa was speaking rapidly, her voice pitched high like she was performing a monologue in a play she had written herself. "I warned them," she was saying, holding the insulated pouch aloft. "They were non-compliant. I had no choice but to intervene. No clear labels. It could be anything. Fentanyl, morphine, heroin. I can't take that risk." Elias didn't wait. He stepped forward. "That's certified biologic medication for my daughter. I have full documentation and TSA medical clearance." Vanessa flinched slightly but recovered quickly, her expression cool. "You're not permitted in this area, sir." "I don't need permission when my daughter's life is at risk," Elias replied, his voice low and measured. He held out the file, containing prescriptions, ingredient documentation, and medical authorization cards. The older woman, her name was Dolores according to her name tag, took the file and began reading, her expression growing more tense by the second. But Vanessa still refused to release the pouch. "We are within our rights to confiscate any unidentified items on board," she declared. "I'll proceed to dispose of it per protocol." Elias felt as though someone had punched him straight in the chest. "You won't touch it again," he said. "If you throw that away, you're destroying something worth over $18,000. And the only thing keeping my daughter walking, breathing, and living like a normal human being." Dolores looked up, her voice trembling slightly. "Vanessa, we need to double-check the—" But it was too late. In that moment, as if to cement her authority one last time, Vanessa twisted open the disposal hatch and dropped the pouch inside without a second's hesitation. The clack it made echoed like the lid of a coffin. Elias froze. The world tilted. He could no longer hear the engine, no longer see the cabin lights. Only the sound of his own ragged breathing remained, and a sharp pain piercing deep in his chest. "What did you just do?" he asked, his voice no longer shaking, but hollow like the air before a storm. Vanessa turned away, but not faster than the look he gave her. "Per aviation regulation, unverified items must be destroyed to ensure flight security," she said. "You were uncooperative. I had no other choice." Dolores had gone pale. She stepped back, her lips pressed tightly together. Elias looked at both women, then down at his hands, the same hands that had saved hundreds of children in emergency rooms, and realized that for the first time in his life, he was powerless. Not because he lacked knowledge, not because he lacked proof, but because someone, given a sliver of authority, had wielded it like a weapon. And this time, the bullet had struck his heart. "You just destroyed $18,400 worth of customized biologic medication for autoimmune disease," Elias said, his voice still soft, but every word landing like a hammer against the floor. "My daughter will relapse within 48 hours. Every hour that passes from now is a reduced chance at recovery. You didn't throw away a pouch. You threw away her future." Vanessa opened her mouth to respond, but Dolores cut in. "He's right. FAA regulations state that when proper medical documentation is presented, flight attendants are not authorized to confiscate or destroy the item without captain's directive." Elias didn't wait to hear more. He turned and began walking away. As he passed Vanessa, he spoke just loud enough for her to hear. "You didn't just make a mistake, you just buried your career." Elias returned to row 7 like a man who had just stepped through a door, behind which an invisible explosion had gone off. Every movement he made was calm and precise, but inside, every cell in his body felt like it was coming apart. He said nothing as he sat down. Renee looked at her husband, searching for answers in that terrifying silence, while Nyla, his little girl curled up in her seat, simply asked in a quiet voice, "Do they still have the pouch, Dad?" Elias didn't answer right away. He gently squeezed her hand and whispered, "It's gone." The answer sliced through the silence between them like a blade, leaving a wound time might not be able to heal. Renee wrapped her arms around their daughter, burying Nyla's face into her shoulder, while Elias stared at the curtain now tightly shut, where just minutes earlier, a piece of his daughter's life had been thrown away by a senseless decision. And this was only the beginning. Throughout the cabin, passengers were starting to sense a shift in the atmosphere. They didn't know what had happened, but they could feel it. Some began to whisper. Some glanced toward row 7, where a family of 3 now sat in stone-cold silence, like statues in an unnamed social experiment at 35,000 feet. Nyla said nothing. She stared straight ahead, her eyes wide but empty, as if no longer anchored to anything real. "My hands are starting to go numb," she said quietly, almost like a confession. "It's okay, baby," Elias replied, his voice steady, unwavering, like an anchor in a storm. "We'll handle it. We're going to land." Neela looked up. "But what about everyone else on the flight?" Elias met her eyes, and for the first time, he didn't know how to answer gently. Because the truth was, he no longer cared. Not out of selfishness, but because the indifference of the system had forced him to choose. Protect his child or continue playing the role of a compliant passenger, denied the right to survive. He had made his choice. And when a father chooses, then the world will have to adjust. At the front of the cabin, Vanessa stood leaned against the supply closet door, her face frozen in stone, arms crossed. Though no one had spoken yet, the shock wave from her actions had already begun to ripple outward, like a quiet spark creeping toward a powder keg. Dolores, the senior lead flight attendant, was speaking into the internal radio. Her voice was low, urgent, but firm. A few passengers near the front began to whisper, "What's going on? Did someone get sick?" No one answered. But in seat 17C, a young woman with dyed purple hair gently placed her phone on the tray table, switched it to live stream mode, clipped on a lapel mic, and stared straight into the lens. "You're watching this live from Sky Connect Flight 218, from Atlanta to Seattle," she said. "A black passenger just had his daughter's legally prescribed medication confiscated and destroyed by a flight attendant. No verification, no process. And yes, we are 35,000 feet in the air." Her name was Skylar Ray, a senior journalism student, and she had no idea that her live stream would become the #1 trending video within 24 hours. Elias didn't know he was being live streamed. He didn't know how many people were watching, but he knew one thing. If he didn't act soon, his daughter would begin to deteriorate within hours. He stood up. "What are you doing?" Renee asked quietly, still holding Nyla in her arms. Elias adjusted his collar, his voice calm but as solid as granite. "I'm going to make them land the plane." That wasn't a threat. It was a declaration, a non-negotiable condition. And on the other side, there were only 2 choices left: comply or collapse morally. He walked toward the front of the cabin again. But this time, it wasn't just suspicious glances following him. This time, there was a young woman filming every step. Some people nodded. An elderly man quietly removed his headphones. No one stopped him. When he pulled aside the curtain again, both Vanessa and Dolores turned to face him. "We're contacting the captain," Dolores said first, her voice tight. "Do it now," Elias replied. "I am officially stating that my daughter, passenger 7B, is no longer medically fit to continue flying. If you do not initiate an emergency landing, I will immediately report this to the FAA, the DOT, and federal health authorities." Vanessa opened her mouth to speak, but Dolores raised a hand to silence her. "Let the captain handle it." Elias nodded. "Good. But let me be clear. If my daughter suffers any complications from this decision, full responsibility will fall on the person who destroyed the medication and those who enabled it." On the live stream screen, The viewer count was skyrocketing. And in the moment Elias turned his back to return to his seat, Schuyler whispered into the camera, "I don't know who he is, but that man is teaching us all a lesson in courage." At 35,000 feet, Elias returned to row 7 with steps that no longer carried hesitation or doubt. If he had once believed that reason could prevail, that a simple explanation might shift the situation, that belief had now shattered completely. Vanessa hadn't just destroyed the medication. She had thrown away the entire chance at a healthy life his family had spent a decade fighting to secure. He sat down, locked eyes with Renee, then looked at Neela. The girl had leaned into her mother, eyes still open but drained of light. Her hand rested on her abdomen, as if trying to press herself into the last remaining shred of physical stability. Ilias didn't need to ask. He recognized every sign of her condition. And when she began curling her legs slightly, as if her joints were already contracting from the loss of medication, he understood. The countdown had begun. "I'm going to fix this," he said. Nyla didn't respond. Renee held her daughter tighter, eyes welling with tears, but still holding on to the composure of a teacher, trying to stand tall in a storm just after the final school bell. "What are you going to do?" she asked. Elias lowered his voice. "Force them to land." Renee nodded. No more words needed. They had been through too much to doubt each other now. Ilias didn't rise immediately. He closed his eyes for 3 seconds, took a deep breath, and opened them. Not as a grieving father, but as Dr. Elias Brooks, the man who had once testified before dozens of medical boards, who had battled insurance companies to save pediatric patients, who had stood at the threshold of life and death and kept his clarity. He pulled out his phone and reopened every file. Copies of prescriptions, letters of medical necessity, TSA transport protocols. All were neatly stored in a folder titled Nyla Treatment. In row 17C, Schuyler Ray was still live streaming. Her face was tense but composed, the screen's glow reflecting off her cheek. "We are witnessing the improper disposal of a legally documented medical treatment mid-flight," she told the camera. The girl's father, a doctor, presented full documentation. The flight attendant still confiscated and threw it away. And if you think this is a minor issue, ask anyone who relies on weekly injections to stay alive. At the front of the cabin, a young flight attendant named Marcus walked briskly to row 7, kneeling gently but urgently. "Mr. Brooks," he said, "the captain would like to speak with you up front." Elias nodded and stood up without a word. As he passed Schuyler, she gave him a subtle nod, an unspoken message of strength. Elias stepped into the front galley for the 3rd time. But this time, Vanessa was gone. Instead, standing there was the captain, a white man in his early 50s, tall, wearing the uniform with 4 gold bars on his shoulder, a seasoned face but cold in expression. "I'm Captain Kenley," he said. "My lead flight attendant tells me you're requesting an emergency landing?" Elias didn't answer right away. He raised his phone, holding it out in front of the captain. "These are all the documents related to the biologic medication my daughter needs. It was destroyed by a flight attendant, despite me presenting everything required." Kenley didn't bother to look. He crossed his arms. "We have safety protocols. If an item cannot be verified—" "No," Elias cut in, his voice dropping low but sharpening like a blade. "Don't say unverified. I'm an immunologist. I have proof. I've provided complete information. This isn't about the drug. This is about bias." Kenley maintained the same blank expression, the kind trained into those taught never to concede under pressure. "We can't initiate a landing based on a single passenger's request unless there's a declared medical emergency." Elias nodded. "Then let me make it official. As of this moment, I am declaring that my daughter, Nyla Brooks, is medically unfit to continue this flight. I am her legal guardian, her attending physician, and I am witnessing the early onset of a relapse. If you proceed to Seattle, you will be placing a medically compromised patient in a situation with irreversible risks. And if anything happens, full legal responsibility will fall on you, personally, and on this airline." Captain Kenley shifted slightly, not crossing his arms now, but placing one hand on the radio clipped to his lapel. "I'll report this to Operations Control," he said. Elias didn't reply. He simply locked eyes with the man, unblinking. And in that moment, The entire mask of procedure that Kenley had wrapped around himself began to crack. The air inside the cabin was no longer that of a normal flight. Something had broken. It made no sound, left no smoke, but everyone could feel it. From row 7 forward, the stairs began to shift, from curious to tense. A strange silence fell, not the peaceful quiet of flying over smooth skies, but the kind of hush that settles when 100 people collectively hold their breath before a storm brews inside the very body of the aircraft. Elias returned from the cockpit area, his posture upright, his steps firm, his face devoid of expression, like a surgeon walking out of an operating room, knowing full well the outcome may determine a child's life. He was no longer a passenger, no longer just the father of a patient. He now embodied a role the very system had forced him into, a plaintiff, a whistleblower, a citizen who would not bow. Skylar Ray, the young woman in seat 17C, was still live streaming. Her voice was clear. The doctor has officially informed the captain that his daughter is medically unfit to continue this flight. If the airline proceeds, it will be knowingly endangering a passenger's life. Ilias reached his row. Neela was slumped against her mother's shoulder, her body beginning to fade, as if it were slowly shutting down non-essential functions to conserve the last bit of energy. "Dad," she whispered, "and what's happening?" Ilias leaned down, wiping the sweat running down her forehead, then murmured, "Everything's being handled. You're going to be okay." In his heart, he wasn't sure he believed that. But to Nyla, her faith in her father had always been stronger than her faith in any medical system. Renee turned to her husband, her eyes sharp like a blade. "What did the captain say?" Elias gently squeezed her hand. "He's calling dispatch, but they don't want to land, not unless someone passes out midair." Renee went silent. She turned back, holding their daughter tighter. Elias checked his watch. Less than 2 hours remained to reach Seattle. But in just 60 more minutes, Neela might no longer be strong enough to sit upright. Her pulse was weakening. Elias knew his daughter's body like a map, one he had memorized down to every corner. He stood again, but this time he didn't head toward the front. He turned to face the entire cabin, from row 7 back. He raised his hand high, firmly. People looked up. "I'm sorry to disturb you all," he began, his voice rising just enough to be heard without a microphone, but clear, like a declaration in a courtroom. "My name is Elias Brooks. I'm a pediatric immunologist at Emory University. My daughter, Nyla, is in seat 7B. She has a rare autoimmune disease. Her only biologic medication, which keeps her alive and functional, was confiscated and destroyed by a flight attendant." A wave of murmurs rippled through the cabin. An older white man removed his headphones. An Asian couple in row 12 turned to look at Elias. "We provided all documentation," Elias continued. "I've tried to resolve everything through the proper channels, respectfully, through the crew, through the captain, but no one is listening. My daughter is now beginning to shut down, and I am left with no choice." He paused for a beat, then concluded, "I am officially requesting an emergency landing at the nearest airport. If you believe this is an inconvenience, I understand. But if you've ever had a child, if you've ever watched someone you love suffer because care was denied, maybe you'll understand that I have no other option." Silence, a different kind of silence. No judgmental stares. Just the eyes of people who, for the first time on this flight, were forced to look up from their screens and realize that sometimes justice does not live where they thought it did. A man in row 5 stood up. He was a middle-aged white man in a gray suit wearing glasses. "I'm an attorney," he said loudly. "I witnessed the entire conduct of the flight attendant. I can confirm this family did not cause a disturbance. They were wronged. They were violated." He extended his business card to Elias. "If you need a legal witness, I'm available." Elias nodded, quietly grateful. At the front of the plane, Skylar Ray whispered into the camera. This is the moment when a man refuses to stay silent, and the system runs out of ways to silence him. The cabin now resembled an emergency conference room in the sky. After Elias addressed the entire plane, the atmosphere changed. It was no longer the passive air of travelers simply wanting to arrive on time. A quiet awakening had begun to spread, as if they realized something greater than themselves was unfolding. And this time, they couldn't pretend not to see it. In the cockpit, Captain Kenley had received a series of calls from airline operations. Over his headset, the voice of Lydia Ferris, the Director of Operational Safety, came through, sharp and firm. Can you confirm that the passenger presented valid prescriptions and medical documentation? Kenley replied, his voice tense. Yes. But the lead flight attendant deemed the vial suspicious and unsafe. We are being live-streamed, Kenley, Lydia said, her tone softer now but loaded with warning. A doctor is requesting a medical landing, and over 40 passengers in the rear cabin are speaking out. If this flight continues as is, we're not just facing a lawsuit, we're looking at a federal media crisis. Kenley paused for a few seconds, then exhaled quietly. He toggled his mic and called Vanessa to the cockpit. Meanwhile, back at row 7B, Elias leaned over to check Neela's pulse. It was weaker than before. Her shirt was damp with sweat. Her abdomen tensed slightly, bracing against muscle spasms, a clear sign her immune system was spiraling out of control. Renee wiped her daughter's face with a damp cloth, trying not to cry. She won't see me panic, she whispered. Elias nodded. That's why I stood up. A passenger, a black woman around 50, got up from seat 11B and stepped toward Elias. I'm an ICU nurse, she said softly. I can't prescribe or administer meds, but if her breathing starts to fail, I can help. Elias gripped her hand, overcome with emotion. Thank you, was all he managed. At the front of the aircraft, Vanessa entered the cockpit. Kenley stood, gesturing for her to take the co-pilot's seat, facing the route display. Flight attendant Vanessa, he began, his tone cold. I've just been informed that a passenger has formally requested a medical emergency landing with complete documentation. But I'm also facing accusations that you destroyed this patient's medication without proper verification. Is that true? Vanessa hesitated. I had doubts about the legitimacy of the vial. It didn't have a TSA label, and that passenger didn't seem trustworthy. Didn't seem trustworthy? Kenley raised an eyebrow. What do you mean by that? Vanessa blushed. I mean, he was too calm. He didn't act like the father of a critically ill patient. Kenley exhaled, staring her in the eye. You just said the most dangerous thing a service employee can say. You didn't evaluate documents. You didn't assess medical risk. You judged a feeling. And you destroyed a 13-year-old girl's medication because of a feeling. Vanessa protested. I followed protocol. Kenley pressed his mic and spoke into his headset. Dispatch, I confirm. I, the captain of flight ORG-227, am requesting emergency landing clearance at Denver. We have a patient whose medication was destroyed with low pulse, signs of hypoglycemia, and muscle deterioration. I will not be held responsible if this flight continues for another 2 hours. There was silence on the other end for 3 seconds. Then Lydia responded. Approved. Notify Denver Air Traffic Control. Activate internal medical emergency procedures. In the cabin, the intercom came on with a calm, automated female voice. Ladies and gentlemen, due to a medical emergency, we will be landing at Denver Airport. Estimated arrival, 24 minutes. Please remain calm and follow crew instructions. A collective exhale rippled through the cabin like a wave breaking. Some passengers applauded. Skylar Ray exclaimed on her live stream, They did it. They're actually landing. This is a victory for patience, persistence, and community voice. In row 7, Renee brought her hand to her mouth, tears falling. Elias held his daughter. We're not at the finish line, but we're no longer flying in the dark. In Nyla's eyes, for the first time in nearly an hour, a small light appeared, faint but real. As the aircraft tilted slightly to reroute toward Denver, the rattling of overhead bins, the hiss of seatbelt pulls, and the heavy breaths of passengers all blended into an unsettling sound. The sound of a flight that was no longer ordinary. But among everything happening, what made the cabin feel most surreal wasn't the change in direction. It was a single screen on Skylar Ray's phone, displaying the words, 89,276 viewers watching live. And the number kept rising. When she started live streaming from her personal account, Skyray Official, it was just a small share for a few thousand loyal followers. But when that man, the doctor, stood up, when she turned the camera to the girl slumped in seat 7B, when the explanation came, short, clear, Powerful. The internet exploded. Viewers began sharing. Her X account started trending. Hashtags like #seat 7B, let her breathe, and flight 227 emergency spread rapidly. And now, just 12 minutes after the flight changed course, over 90,000 people were watching through tiny screens, all waiting to see, could justice actually take flight at 35,000 feet? Skylar turned the camera back toward herself. She quickly fixed her hair, eyes glued to the rising viewer count. "We're witnessing an event that isn't just an airline crisis," she said, her voice clear, not shouting, but steady enough for her audience to feel the urgency. "This is the biggest test a carrier has ever faced, where passengers themselves have to speak up because a child was denied her chance to live. And you, all of you watching, are living proof that the world doesn't look away anymore." Below her feed, comments scrolled too fast to read, but some words hit like thunder. "Call the FAA now. Sue the airline. We stand with seat 7B. Is she still breathing? Where's the doctor?" Skylar turned the lens back toward Elias sitting beside his daughter. Though his head was down, checking her pulse, his face couldn't hide the fear creeping into every cell. Beside him, Renee whispered to their child, her hand resting on Nyla's forehead, as if trying to send warmth from a mother's heart into a daughter's body that was growing colder by the minute. The cabin lights dimmed. An announcement played. "Flight crew, prepare for emergency landing. Passengers, fasten seatbelts, remain seated, and do not use the lavatories." No one moved. Every gaze shifted toward the middle of the plane, row 7, where an invisible battle was quietly unfolding. At Orion Air's Emergency Coordination Center on the 14th floor of headquarters in Seattle, 3 large screens were broadcasting Skylar's livestream. A media crisis team, 4 people, the PR director, an internal legal counsel, a crisis communications specialist, and a security coordinator, scrambled into action. "Viewers just hit 91,000, one staffer reported. "CNN has called for comment. BuzzFeed, Vox, and Rolling Stone are tracking." Dalton Green, the middle-aged white PR director, turned to legal. "Can we file a takedown request?" The attorney shook his head. "Not if she's just reporting what she sees. And if we interfere now, it'll be a disaster." "We need a spokesperson immediately," said the crisis specialist. "We can't let Let Her Breathe hit the national top 3 without a statement." Dalton nodded. "Draft a quick release. Orion Air affirms that passenger safety is paramount. We are cooperating in a full investigation into incident ORG-227... Someone objected. "That's too short." Dalton replied coldly. "It's not about word count. It's about every word avoiding litigation." In the sky above, the aircraft began to descend. The engine tone shifted lower. Skylar mounted her phone on the seatback tray, framing the middle cabin in view. The viewer count climbed to 92,000. A nurse in emergency uniform appeared behind her, another passenger who had volunteered to assist. Skylar nodded softly, took her hand and whispered, "She's in 7B, the daughter of an immunologist. They're just trying to keep her alive until we land." The nurse simply said, "I'll stay close in case." For the next 10 minutes, no one on the plane spoke. Only the engines whir, the pilot's altitude announcements, and the sound of hearts racing filled the cabin. From row 17 and back, a few passengers began filming from their own phones, streaming from different angles. Twitter flooded with cabin images, clips of Elias speaking, and photos of the discarded medication. One user wrote, "I'm in 14C. I saw the attendant call the vial trash and drop it into a waste bag right in front of the father. I've never felt more ashamed of my silence." Elias checked his watch. 8 minutes left. Neela was now unconscious. She no longer spoke, her body limp. Elias checked her pulse. Still there, but barely. He turned to his wife. "Renee, be ready. The moment we touch down, we need EMS at the gate. I'll carry her. You stay close." Renee nodded. "I've been ready since the day she was born," she whispered. Skylar looked into the camera. "We're preparing to land. I don't know what's going to happen next. But if anyone among these 90,000 viewers has ever felt helpless in the face of a system, this is the moment to act. Don't let the story end when the wheels hit the ground." And then, right at that moment, The wheels touched down with a roar. When the landing gear slammed onto the Denver International Airport runway, the entire cabin jolted as if everyone held their breath at once. Orion Air Flight ORG-227 had officially made an emergency landing. No applause like usual. No joyful relief. Only a heavy silence draped over the rows like a cold blanket after hours of tension in the clouds. Neela remained motionless on her mother's lap. Elias kept his hand on her chest, eyes unblinking. The pulse was still there, but weaker. The cabin seemed frozen, suspended in the moment between touchdown and a full stop. Then suddenly, like a sharp knock, there was pounding on the outer door. Emergency personnel had arrived. 4 medics rushed in, pushing a stretcher, not waiting for flight crew instructions. Elias stood, faster than anyone thought he could. He gently lifted his daughter onto the stretcher while giving clear, clipped directions. Slow breaths, 10 liters of oxygen through mask, IV line ready, avoid left arm, signs of venous occlusion. The lead nurse paused, eyes widening. "Are you Doctor Elias Vaughn?" Elias nodded. No further words were needed. The emergency team followed every instruction to the letter. Renee stayed close, her hand never leaving her daughter's. Skylar continued live streaming, though her hand trembled now. Viewers weren't just watching, they were feeling it. In part because they saw a thin, worn-down father walking like a man with nothing left to lose. And in part because somehow, everyone knew, this should never have happened. Outside on the tarmac, dozens of cameras pointed toward the aircraft's exit. The media storm had officially begun. A sleek silver car bearing the Orion Air logo pulled up just 15 meters from the plane. A man in a light gray suit stepped out. Salt and pepper hair, polished black shoes, small name tag. Harlan Leeds, Executive Vice President of Communications. Harlan wasn't alone. Behind him were 2 others, a young woman in a cream suit carrying a document case, and a broad white man in a navy suit with dark sunglasses, clearly legal counsel. As Harlan stepped down, he tapped his earpiece, speaking quietly. "Status inside?" A voice responded, "The girl's been taken out." Press are crowding the domestic gate. Several people filming have been identified as major bloggers. Livestream just hit 97,000 concurrent views and climbing. Harlan gave a curt nod. "Keep the feed stable. No public statements until I speak with Miss Schuyler." Inside the plane, passengers still hadn't been allowed to disembark. The captain announced an internal investigation was underway and requested everyone remain in place. Some began to grow agitated. A loud voice from the back called out, "We're not criminals. They want us quiet because they know they screwed up." Schuyler turned her camera toward the voice and whispered, "I'm not leaving until I know exactly how Nyla's doing." A flight attendant approached and said softly, "Miss Schuyler, Mr. Harlan Leeds, representing Orion Air, is waiting for you in the terminal." Schuyler responded without hesitation, "I'm not going alone." She pointed to an older female passenger who had spoken out from the start. "She's coming with me. I need a witness." In the Denver airport's emergency intake area, now transformed into a temporary briefing room, floodlights from cameras lit the ceiling like daylight. Schuyler entered with her witness and was immediately surrounded by 3 local news crews. Harlan Leeds was already waiting, his smile thin, hand extended to greet her. But she stepped back half a pace, camera still rolling. "I hope you understand this entire conversation is being recorded," she said. Harlan kept his smile. "Of course, Orion Air values transparency. We just want to clarify a few things to protect both passengers and our company." "Good," Schuyler replied, "because the hundreds of thousands watching also want the truth." Harlan took a seat, crossed his legs, and rested his hand lightly on his knee. "First," he began, "Orion Air deeply regrets the incident. We're conducting an independent investigation, but I must clarify. From our internal report, the vial had no proper labeling, and the attendant followed protocol in disposing of unverified items to ensure flight safety." Schuyler didn't interrupt. She simply angled the camera toward her witness. The woman spoke, her voice shaky but firm. "I was in row 6. I saw the attendant ask what the medicine was, and Mr. Elias explained clearly. Name, dosage, everything. They refused him with no reason, then threw it away." Harlan's lips tightened. "We'll verify that testimony. What about the girl? Skylar asked. Who's responsible for her not getting her meds in time? Harlan's tone cooled. Orion Air cannot confirm the medical condition of any passenger due to privacy concerns. Any assumptions may create legal complications. Skylar inhaled slowly. She knew men like Harlan, highly trained, surgically precise with words, never saying more than they had to. So you're denying all responsibility, aren't you? She asked. No, Harlan replied instantly. I'm fulfilling my legal duty. She looked him square in the eyes. Then let me fulfill mine. She turned back to the camera, voice sharp and unwavering. This is Orion Air's official representative. No apology, no admission of fault, only legal wording to shield themselves, while a young girl still fights for her life in a hospital. A message notification chimed. Skylar glanced at her phone. A text from Elias. She's stabilizing. Thank you for not backing down. She swallowed hard, then stared into the lens. That little girl, her name is Nyla, has made it through the critical phase. But this isn't over. Not just because she survived, but because there are millions of other kids who might end up in the same situation, if no one stands up. As the first rays of morning sunlight touched the ground in Denver, the air inside Orion Air's headquarters in Seattle felt heavier than the pressure of any cloud layer they had ever flown through. Within just 12 hours of Flight ORG-227's emergency landing, an information earthquake had triggered a domino effect unlike anything seen in the history of commercial aviation. It began with the Denver Post's front-page headline in bright red. A little girl was denied life in the sky, and Orion stayed silent. Almost simultaneously, social media ignited. Twitter, now X, saw thousands of retweets of Skylar's livestream. The original video had already surpassed 8.7 million views overnight. The hashtag #Justice for Nyla climbed to #1 in just 4 hours, overtaking even updates on the massive hurricane sweeping through Florida. But what made the Orion Air Executive Board truly break a cold sweat wasn't the view count. It was the names resharing the clip. Pop star Quincy Rain, 67 million followers, tweeted, I lost my younger brother once due to slow medical response during travel. Watching this made me shake. That little girl deserved more protection than the plane itself. Oscar-winning actress Selena Ward wrote, I can't believe this is America. An airline can throw away my child's medication, then blame it on protocol? Veteran journalists like Noah Flynn of The Atlantic and Meryl King from NPR reposted the video and publicly demanded an official apology from Orion Air. But the harshest blow came from a tweet not by a celebrity, but from a single mom in Illinois. If they can do this to Dr. Elias Vaughn and his daughter, a man who saved thousands of lives, then what chance do I and my son have? That post garnered over 400,000 likes in just 3 hours. And with that, Orion's entire strategy of silent containment officially collapsed. Inside the conference room on the 18th floor, Harlan Leeds, who just the night before had stood like a pillar of stone, now sat with his head bowed, face pale. The media team's presentation no longer bore the title Internal Response Plan, but now read Crisis Level 3, Full System Public Backlash. A member of the legal team stood to suggest a solution. We should release a condolence statement, don't admit fault, cite aviation safety law, emphasize adherence to protocol. But before he could finish, the new CEO, Kira Maddox, tapped the table lightly and said, No, if we're still talking about protocol right now, we're going to get burned alive. I want to know, who signed off on the policy to dispose of unidentified foreign items without a medical exception clause? Silence filled the room. Then from the far end, a hand slowly rose. It was Craig Donovan, the man who had rewritten the internal safety manual the year before. He stammered, I didn't expect it to be enforced that rigidly. Kira looked him in the eye. Not expecting it is no excuse for a child nearly dying from a document with your signature on it. At that same moment, inside Colorado Children's Hospital, Elias sat by his daughter's bedside, still holding her small hand tightly. Neela was recovering. Her heart rate had stabilized, and the oxygen was being tapered. But his mind was far from at peace, because he knew that while Skylar's viral clip was brave and necessary, it also meant she could become a target for Orion's legal team. hit with a barrage of internal policy violations and video recording statutes. When Renee walked in, holding a steaming cup of coffee, he said quietly, "I'm afraid they'll sue Skylar." Renee sat beside him, meeting his gaze. "If they do, they'll be digging their own grave. I have a feeling the public won't forget this time." And she was right. Within 48 hours, 7 major news networks aired special segments titled Flight 227, Aviation or Evasion. One of the most talked about moments came from Skylar's appearance on Griffindale's late-night talk show, the host known for his razor-sharp interviews. Sitting across from Skylar, now hailed as a symbol of the woke traveler generation, Griffin asked, "If you could say one sentence to the CEO of Orion Air right now, what would it be?" Skylar paused for a moment, then answered, "I don't need them to say sorry. I need them to change how they treat us. Because life can't be something left out of a checklist. And because no one, not even a 7-year-old girl, should be seen as a threat to flight safety just for carrying her medication." The audience erupted in applause. That same night, her TV clip reached over 12 million views on YouTube. Meanwhile, Elias began receiving letters from around the country. Doctors, nurses, even former patients he had once treated. An email from Kansas read, "You saved my son from leukemia in 2017. Today he's 18 and applying to medical school. We won't let you stand alone." Then came the truly unexpected. The American Medical Association, AMA, released a formal statement demanding that the FAA and Department of Transportation open a federal investigation into passenger medical rights in aviation. The statement read, "No one, not even one of America's top physicians, should be denied access to life-saving medication for a loved one due to an inhumane procedure." Cracks began to show inside Orion Air. Kira Maddox convened a closed-door meeting. After hours of debate, she issued a historic decision. "We will hold a nationally broadcast press conference, and I, as the new CEO, will appear personally. But first, I need a private conversation with Elias Vaughn." The air inside hospital room 403 still carried the faint smell of antiseptics. Soft white light settled over every edge of the bed, and each faint beep from the heart monitor echoed the heavy rhythm of Elias Vaughn's breathing. Outside the room, the hallway no longer belonged to nurses or families. It had become a corridor of containment, with 3 layers of security, one from the hospital, one from Orion Air, and one from the media team trying to sneak in a frame. But inside it was just him, his daughter Nyla still gently asleep, and the woman who had just walked in, carrying both a promise and a threat, Kira Maddox. She wore a charcoal gray suit. No jewelry, no phone, no assistant. Just a cream-colored folder tied with string, labeled simply, ORG-227 Incident. Personal Meeting. Kira looked at Nyla for a few seconds, then pulled a chair and sat across from Elias, keeping a precise distance of 2 meters. Elias nodded slightly, eyes steady. There was no handshake, no gratuitous apology, just the silent acknowledgement that both of them had come too far to turn back. "Dr. Vaughn," she began, her voice steady and hoarse like someone fresh off an all-night boardroom war. "I'm not here to offer a corporate-style apology." Elias didn't respond. Kira continued, "I'm here to ask you, if I dismantle the entire legal block, lift the media suppression orders, and publicly admit system failure, would you be willing to help rebuild that system from the inside?" Elias stared directly into her eyes. "I came here because my daughter nearly died on your aircraft. I didn't come here to help you patch up brand optics." Kira opened the folder and pulled out a single document. "I understand. This is a formal statement that neither you nor your family will be sued by Orion for filming or distributing the video. I've signed it. Personally." She placed the paper on the table. Elias didn't pick it up. He simply let out a long breath and said, "If you came for forgiveness, you've got the wrong man. I don't have the right to forgive a system that left thousands vulnerable to what happened to my daughter. If you want to fix it, you have to start by admitting fault. On national television. No spokesperson. No press release. You, directly." Kira didn't blink. "I intend to do that, but I need to know, once I say it, you won't walk away." Elias smiled faintly. "I won't walk away, but I'm not collaborating. I'm demanding. I demand the public elimination of the no exception clause for medical emergencies. I demand retraining of all flight crews within 45 days. I demand the creation of a passenger allergy and emergency medical protection fund. And I demand you place my daughter's name in your new training curriculum as a symbol. Kira nodded slightly. Done. Then added as a quiet confession. I once lost a sibling because a flight was delayed 7 minutes. I know the cost of procedural correctness. For the first time, Elias looked at her without hostility. Then you know what needs to be done. At that moment, the hospital room door swung open. Skylar stepped in, dark circles under her eyes from exhaustion, but a fire still burning in her gaze, the same one she had when she raised her camera in that airplane cabin. She looked at Kira without a word, then turned to her father. I heard from people out there. Orion's holding a press conference? Elias nodded. Kira answered instead. I'll be the one speaking, live broadcast nationwide, in 36 hours. Skylar stepped closer, locking eyes with the CEO. And what will you say? Kira looked at her, the same young woman her staff once labeled reckless, unprofessional, and answered for the first time with a trace of hesitation. I will say that my airline forgot a child, and I will tell exactly what happened. Skylar nodded. Then say this, that a 7-year-old girl taught grown adults how to be human, and that sometimes, to save a life, you must be willing to break the rules. The air in the room seemed to pause, a moment not of stillness, but of propulsion. Kira nodded. She stood, gathered her folder, and walked toward the door. Just before leaving, she stopped, not turning back, only to say one thing. Thank you for not staying silent. And then, the door closed. Wednesday, 9 a.m., every major national television network in the United States simultaneously aired a live event with no precedent. The CEO of a major airline, Orion Air, holding a press conference without a PR team, without a spokesperson, and without pre-screen questions. From Los Angeles to Charlotte, from Detroit to Miami, the giant screens in shopping malls all displayed the same image. Kira Maddox, standing in the middle of JFK Airport, with the flight status board behind her showing all departures, paused for 15 minutes, just so the public could listen without distraction. She wore a gray overcoat, her hair tied back, no jewelry, holding a microphone and a thin stack of papers, not to read a speech, but to present something new, the official document for a medical protocol named NILA. Kira began not with an apology, but with a statement. 7 days ago, a 7-year-old girl named Nyla Vaughn was denied emergency medical assistance on flight or 227 because a flight attendant claimed there was no doctor's note attached to the ticket. That child nearly lost her life, and I, as the head of Orion Air, I take responsibility. The silence that followed wasn't because the audience couldn't hear. It was because every sound had stopped. At Columbia Hospital in Denver, where Elias and Skylar sat beside Neela, the entire medical staff had paused to watch. A doctor leaned toward Elias and whispered, "We've never seen a CEO do this." Elias only nodded gently. Skylar, eyes locked on the screen, clutched the hand of her slowly waking sister. On live television, Kira continued, I'm not here to defend a brand. I'm here to declare that as of today, Orion Air officially abolishes any policy that obstructs access to emergency medical care. And further, we are introducing the NILA protocol, mandatory for all alliance partners and affiliate airlines within 90 days. Then she held up the protocol. It will take effect as an industry standard without waiting for government approval, because sometimes people must move faster than the system. Then she continued, her voice beginning to break. I used to think my job was to keep shareholders steady. But that day, when I watched the footage from inside the cabin, I realized if Skylar Vaughn hadn't recorded the truth, if no passenger had stood up, if there hadn't been a father like Elias Vaughn, then I wouldn't be standing here today. I'd be at a congressional hearing. The entire JFK concourse rose to their feet. No one told them to, and no one sat down for the next 9 minutes. As Kira announced one by one, Orion Air would establish the Passenger Allergy Protection Fund with an initial $7 million. All Orion flight attendants must undergo a new training program called the 7B Initiative. The name Nyla Vaughn would be permanently inscribed at the Flight Crew Training Center in Texas. The policy requiring a medical note with a ticket would be abolished across the entire system. But the emotional peak wasn't in the announcements. It came with the final video clip displayed on the screen behind her. Never-before-seen footage filmed by a passenger's camera. The moment Skylar raised her phone and said, "Don't touch her, she's my sister," followed by Elias's voice shouting, "She can't breathe." Then came Nyla's eyes, fading, but still holding tightly to her stuffed bear. No one in the audience looked away. When the screen faded to black, Kira spoke a single sentence. "That child is alive today, but our silence almost killed her, and silence ends now." 6 hours later, on Twitter, TikTok, Instagram, and Reddit, the hashtag #Nyla protocol ranked #1 worldwide. Other airlines began releasing statements. A small regional carrier in Oregon declared it would adopt the protocol even before Orion. A civil rights attorney specializing in passenger protections filed a class action lawsuit against airlines that had enforced medical denial clauses. A single mother in Atlanta posted a video showing her son bringing allergy medicine on board for the first time in 6 years without being searched. And in Denver, inside the hospital lobby, a nurse quietly stepped in and smiled at Elias and Skylar. "Someone's waiting for you in the atrium." When they stepped out, they saw hundreds of people of every race, every walk of life, standing in rows, silently holding signs. "Thank you, Skylar. Thank you, Dr. Vaughn. Nyla changed everything." Elias said nothing. He simply turned to his daughter, now in a wheelchair, who looked at the crowd with curious eyes. Then he bent down and asked, "Is there anything you'd like to say?" Nyla thought for a moment, then looked up and softly said, "I just want every kid to be able to breathe, even if grown-ups don't believe they need to." Elias froze, and Skylar broke into tears. 3 weeks later, at the World Aviation Federation conference, delegates from 29 countries stood and signed a resolution recognizing the Nyla Protocol as an international medical standard for transoceanic carriers. And in Dallas, a small glass memorial was erected, etched with only 7 words: "One seat, one voice, one protocol, Nyla." Have you ever wondered if a single seat could rewrite an entire industry? Have you ever witnessed a child who didn't have to scream, didn't have to rage, yet still made the whole system stop and listen? And have you ever asked yourself, if you were in that airplane cabin that day, would you have stood up or stayed quiet? Today, Nyla is still alive, not because of a famous doctor, not because of a flawless policy, but because of a sister who dared to press record, a father who never let go of his daughter's hand, and a community that refused to accept silence as the default. If this story moved you in a way that made you feel hopeful because people like them exist, or made your throat tighten because this should have changed a long time ago, then don't let the story end here. Click subscribe to keep hearing the things people often overlook. Leave a comment. Tell us, if you were in seat 7B, what would you have done? Or simply write the name of someone you know who quietly stands up for others. Because this world doesn't need another perfect airline. It needs more people who do the right thing when no one's watching.